Hi, my name is Dr. Amber Wutich. I'm a President's Professor of Anthropology at Arizona State University and Director of its Center for Global Health. I'm also the Director of the NSF Cultural Anthropology Methods Program. I'm excited to share with you this lecture called Grounded Theory for Anthropologists. I am so passionate about teaching grounded theory for a number of reasons. One is that on many levels, grounded theory represents a formalization of what most anthropologists do when they do ethnography. In fact, one time I was teaching these methods to senior scholars, and afterwards, one grumpily came up to me and said, "You know what I hated about your lecture?" "What?" I said. "I had to teach myself ethnography in the field, and you made it so that everyone can do it." And that is my goal here. Grounded theory represents an inductive approach that uses ground-up methods to develop concepts and interrelationships between them. As such, it means you can go into your research with very broad questions, just a theoretical lens, and a curiosity about what's going on. Now, this is a great approach for inductive research designs, but it's also true that sometimes people propose a great confirmatory research project. They get funding to do the research, and through no fault of their own, the whole design falls apart. Grounded theory gives you a way to step in and start fresh and say what's going on and still do very high quality research. So grounded theory is great for people who are looking for a more formalized approach to doing inductive research right out of the bat. It's also great for people who find themselves in a crisis situation and have to start all over very rapidly with inductive research when they hadn't planned to do it. And this is why I think everyone, no matter what their research approach, should have a background and basic understanding of grounded theory. Now, since grounded theory was developed in sociology in the 1960s, it has become very highly developed as a research approach. As you can see on this slide here, Glaser and Strauss were the initial scholars who created grounded theory together. But soon after, they split off into two different fields. Glaser continued to take a radically inductive or exploratory approach to grounded theory, while Strauss, and later Strauss and Corbin, began to develop an approach that allowed for a little more mixing between inductive and deductive concepts. Today, there are 5 main approaches to grounded theory established in the literature, and in this lecture, I hover above them and just try to give you a general sense of what the process is rather than delving deeply into any one specifically. But of course, for those who want to go on to develop expertise in grounded theory, you'll probably train in one of these 5 traditions. So to begin, what does theory mean in grounded theory? Kathy Sharmaz is one of the great methodologists of grounded theory. She took a constructivist approach to grounded theory, and her writing is, in my view, some of the clearest writing out there. She says, "In my view, a theory explicates a phenomenon, specifies concepts which categorize the relevant phenomena, explains relationships between the concepts, and provides a framework for making predictions." Now, this is important to understand. Grounded theory is basically about beginning in a very open-ended and exploratory way to study a phenomenon, identifying specific concepts and the interrelationships between them, and integrating those concepts in a way that provides a theory that makes predictions. Now, not every grounded theory is able to accomplish all those pieces of the analysis, and that's okay. But it's important to keep in mind that this is actually the goal. Step 1 in grounded theory is theoretical sampling. So once you know the phenomenon you're studying and your theoretical lens, so you know why you're asking what's going on here, you begin to select participants into the study. So let's imagine you're primarily using an interviewing approach for your grounded theory. You would begin by selecting one or a handful of people to interview. As soon as you collect those interviews and transcribe them, you would begin immediately to analyze the data. Once you've completed the analysis of the data with coding and memo writing, you would then enable your selection of the next person you interview to be informed by what you found from your first few interviews. This is what we call theoretical sampling. Now, it's basically just a very sophisticated and advanced form of judgment sampling or non-probability purposive sampling. And it's informed by your growing understanding of the data and what the next person can contribute to your understanding of the phenomenon. Now, the trick about theoretical sampling is you're really only meant to bring in one piece of data or one respondent at a time, analyze the data, and then go on finding someone further that you need to help fill out your understanding of the phenomenon. Once you hit theoretical saturation, you can stop. That means you have all the concepts and all the interconnections between them. So there's no a priori number of interviews that's appropriate for grounded theory. It depends on how long it takes you to understand your phenomenon. We talked about coding happening at every stage after the interviews. And there are two main kinds of initial coding in grounded theory. This is step 2 of your analysis. The most famous one, which we've all heard of because of the software, is in vivo coding. In vivo coding essentially captures key concepts, idioms, euphemisms, metaphors, analogies, and so forth that describe a phenomenon in a way that is really meaningful to insiders in that phenomenon. So you can see some examples on the left-hand side here from Kathy Sharma's work on business executives. And so, for example, the in vivo code flying low refers to not confronting an offender with long-standing grievances against their behavior. Anyone who's not a member of this phenomenon would not understand flying low to mean that, and that's one of the hallmarks that you've got in vivo code. This technique for coding is not just useful for grounded theory, of course, but can be mixed into any number of qualitative designs. On the right-hand side, you see line-by-line coding. This is another one of the methodological hallmark contributions of grounded theory. It means going into your interview or archival data and closely reading each line in a way that allows you to slightly generalize up from the data contributed by that line. Then later stages of coding process and continue to generalize from these line-by-line codes that you initially produce. Throughout all of this process, in vivo coding and line-by-line coding, grounded theorists engage in step 3, memo writing. This means closely documenting what you mean by the emerging codes and insights of your analysis. One of the great advantages of memo writing, Kathy Sharma argues, is that if you have been dedicated in your memo writing practice, you basically have the initial draft of your publication already written up when you complete your analysis, because each memo documents in very rich ways the meaning of the themes that you've identified in your analysis. So memo writing is another one of the grounded theory techniques that is often adopted in a range of qualitative research practices. In step 4, you take those tiny segmented codes that are produced from in vivo coding or line-by-line, open or initial coding, and you begin to identify larger and larger themes that encompass bigger chunks of the phenomenon you're studying. Now, different grounded theory traditions have different ways of naming this stage of the analysis, but generally we can think of level 2 coding that re-examines the initial codes and identifies larger and larger themes. Then level 3 coding that begins to look at the interconnections between those themes that you identified in level 1 and level 2 coding. And then finally, level 4 coding refers to when a grounded theory converges and everything comes together in one theory that allows for prediction. Now, as this triangle indicates, not every grounded theory comes together at the level 4 level. However, most people are trying to at least get to level 3, where they identify the interconnections between the themes. Step 5 is reaching theoretical saturation. Now, theoretical saturation is an important concept from grounded theory that's often misunderstood. If you look at the image on the right-hand side and you imagine that the squares represent themes and the lines represent connections between them, this is a visual representation of theoretical saturation. It basically means that you've gone through the process of level 1, 2, and 3 coding, not just identifying and describing major themes, but also looking at how they're interrelated in a way that builds and explains a phenomenon. In the literature on sample size, identification, and qualitative research, and thematic analysis, people are generally more focused on something called descriptive saturation, theme saturation, or data saturation. And this is really just about identifying and describing the themes in a standalone way, as you see pictured here on the left, rather than thoroughly exploring the interrelationships between the themes. Now, both of these are perfectly legitimate research goals, but only the one on the right represents the endpoint of grounded theory research. So, people often misunderstand some elements of grounded theory, and Sotheby, a journal editor, actually wrote a piece called What Grounded Theory Is Not to try to prevent people from making these 7 major mistakes. One problem is that people think that because grounded theory is a radically inductive approach, that you can just ignore the literature. And that's not the case. Your exploratory work in grounded theory should be informed by the literature. And of course, the final published findings must always engage in and advance the literature. It's not a presentation of raw data, as we've discussed in this lecture. There is a very clear analytic process that is implied in grounded theory. Grounded theory is not a confirmatory or deductive design, so you shouldn't see any hypothesis testing or deductive type coding as is appropriate for content analysis or word-based analysis. Grounded theory is infamously difficult and time-consuming. Because particularly of the requirement that you continue theoretical sampling until you reach saturation. This means there's no easy endpoint, and people can spend a lot of time going back again and again for more interviews. It's not mechanical or formulaic, so while there is a set of techniques that are used, most people apply them in their own sort of unique way, and it's not perhaps highly reproducible entirely. It's not a pure perfected method, but really what method is, just like most methods, we're still continuing to learn how it works and to conduct methodological research to advance its practice. And the most important one, it is not an excuse for having no method or having sloppy methods. Grounded theory methodologists are among the most rigorous methodologists in qualitative research, and they definitely have very little tolerance for methodological sloppiness. So hopefully these tips and tricks will be helpful to know what to avoid in doing grounded theory. It's also important to remember that you can borrow specific techniques like in vivo coding from grounded theory and use them in a different kind of research design, including a mixed methods design. And if you choose to do that, just name the technique you used and provide a citation. There's no need to pretend that you're doing grounded theory if you've not adopted the entirety of the assumptions in a grounded theory design. Rather, just say, I've used this technique for this purpose, citation, and you're done. Grounded theory has many wonderful techniques to offer, and that's a great thing to do. Barney Glaser, in one of his keynotes, provided some tips and tricks about who is good at grounded theory. And he gave 3 indications that you might be good at grounded theory. He says people who are good at grounded theory are people who, 1, have an ability to conceptualize data, 2, have an ability to tolerate some confusion, And 3 also have an ability to tolerate confusion's regression. So this basically means people who are able to spend some time at this nebulous phase of the research where you don't quite know where it's going, but once you start to see categories and themes and interconnections emerge, you're able to clamp down on that analysis, complete it, and summarize it. And it's true that these kind of personality traits that are common to grounded theorists aren't for everyone, but for those who do think in this way, it is a wonderful set of techniques. And so finally, to sum up, if you were to ever look at the sort of roadmap to grounded theory, it always looks like something like you see on the slide. It's very complex, it has many steps, it's iterative and loops back on itself constantly. You should not allow this to deter you from adopting the method. The basic idea is that you just keep moving forward through a data collection and analysis process, reflecting and iterating back until you get clarity in the codes and interrelationships between them. And while the process to do that can be a bit complex with a lot of back arrows, at the end of the day, this is really a clear method for advancing inductive research.